There is a theory that has been taught in classrooms, repeated in documentaries, and shared across the internet for 30 years. It goes like this. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano in Indonesia erupted so violently that it nearly ended the human species. We came within a hair of never existing at all. And the wild thing is, almost nobody telling you that story mentions that the scientists who study it most closely have been quietly walking it back for years. Debates about the impacts of the most recent Toba supereruption on early human populations are ongoing, although one famous theory has now been largely debunked. And yet, here we are. Every video, every article, every documentary still leads with the same dramatic near-extinction framing. So in this video, we're going to do something different. We're going to walk through what actually happened, the real scale of this eruption, the evidence that was used to build the theory, and then the newer evidence that is quietly dismantling it piece by piece. Because the truth that's emerging is actually more interesting than the story everyone's been telling. Before we get there, though, let's talk about why this theory felt so believable in the first place. Because it starts with something genuinely strange about our own DNA. Here's a fact that should stop you cold. There is less genetic diversity between all 8 billion humans alive on Earth right now than there is within a single troop of 50 chimpanzees. Not all chimpanzees, one troop. A small group of primates living in the same forest has more genetic variety among themselves than our entire species does across every continent, every country, every person who has ever lived in the modern era. That is an almost incomprehensible level of sameness. And for decades, scientists pointed at one event as the explanation: the eruption of the Toba supervolcano. One of the most dangerous volcanic systems on the planet lies beneath the waters of the enormous Lake Toba on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. Around 74,000 years ago, during the late Pleistocene, the explosion of this enormous magma reservoir produced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the history of the genus Homo. And when I say large, I need you to actually feel what that means, because the number alone doesn't do it justice. With a VEI of 8, more than 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material was ejected. To put that into some kind of human scale, the total amount ejected from the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980 was only about 1/4 of a cubic kilometer. The Toba eruption would have been the equivalent of about 10,000 Mount St. Helens eruptions. It was enough to fill all of Lake Victoria with volcanic matter, and it would have been 3 to 5 times the volume of Mount Everest. Ashfall from the event was 9 meters thick in some parts of the world. 9 meters. That's a 3-story building made entirely of ash, sitting on top of the landscape. The broiling, supersonic pyroclastic flows that erupted from the caldera scorched an area of 20,000 square kilometers, equivalent to wiping out over 25 New York cities. So the eruption itself? Absolutely real. Absolutely staggering. Nobody is arguing about that part. What they are arguing about is what happened next, and specifically, what it did to us. The Toba catastrophe theory suggested that the eruption led to a volcanic winter big enough to wipe out most early humans. The theory linked the eruption to genetic evidence, suggesting there was a steep drop in the human population around this time, a genetic bottleneck that may have resulted in a surviving population of only 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. 3 to 10,000 people. On the entire planet. That's smaller than a lot of colleges. For more than 30 years, the scientific consensus held that the eruption of Toba triggered a volcanic winter that plunged the planet into a deep freeze, pushing early humans to the brink of extinction. And that story made sense. The genetic diversity data was real. The eruption was real. The ash was real. The logic seemed airtight. But here's where it starts to fall apart. And I'll come back to the biggest crack in the whole theory at the end, because it changes everything. The first problem is what the eruption actually did to the climate, and specifically, where it did it. Most versions of this story describe a global volcanic winter. Ash blocking the sun, temperatures plummeting everywhere, crops dying, animals starving, humans with nowhere to go. And that's a compelling image. But the environmental impacts appear to have varied dramatically across different regions. The findings challenge the long-standing assumption that the eruption triggered a global environmental catastrophe that bottlenecked human populations. Refined climate modeling suggests that while parts of the northern hemisphere may have experienced significant cooling, much of the southern hemisphere experienced little to no such effect. The global winter that gets described in nearly every documentary about this topic was, in a meaningful sense, not truly global. It was heavily concentrated in one hemisphere. That's a major distinction, because it means there were large regions of Earth where the sky didn't go dark, where temperatures didn't crash, where life carried on in something close to its normal rhythm, and where there's warmth, there's food. And where there's food, humans survive. Which brings us to the second problem: the people who were living right in the ash zone and did not die. In southern India, in a place called the Jureru Valley, archaeologists found something that should have rewritten the Toba narrative the moment it was discovered. The Jwalapuram site in the Jureru Valley revealed an extensive collection of Middle Paleolithic tools above and below the ash layer, further supporting the notion of demographic stability in the wake of the eruption. Above and below, before the eruption and after it. The same people making the same kinds of tools, in the same valley, covered in Toba ash. Lithic evidence documents long-term continuities before and after the eruption, indicating the Toba eruption had a minimal impact on the underlying system of flake production in the valley. Think about what that means. These weren't people who survived by fleeing to some remote corner of the planet. They were sitting directly under the fallout zone and kept going. And India wasn't the only place. New discoveries show that groups of early humans survived immediately after the Toba event, even in Sumatra itself, the island where the volcano actually was. Now, you might be wondering how anyone survived at all. If the sky was full of ash and temperatures were dropping, how do you feed yourself? There's a lesser-known theory that's genuinely fascinating here. As rivers and water sources contracted in the aftermath of the eruption, fish became concentrated into shrinking pools and waterholes, making them dramatically easier to catch. Climate stress, in at least some regions, may have accidentally created a food surplus rather than a famine. The environment was punishing, yes, but humans are remarkably good at finding the angle that keeps them alive. Here's something else that doesn't come up in most Toba content. The 74,000-year eruption wasn't even Toba's first super eruption. The volcano has erupted at least 3 times before that, roughly 840,000 years ago, and roughly 1.2 million years ago, in similarly massive events. Every video treats the famous eruption as a singular, one-off catastrophe. But Toba has done this before, multiple times, and life on Earth kept going each time. There's also a technical issue with the original models that built the years of frozen darkness narrative. Early climate simulations, the ones from the 1990s that formed the backbone of the Toba catastrophe theory, significantly overestimated how much sulfur dioxide the eruption injected into the stratosphere. Researchers have since demonstrated that those early models may have been off by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. 1 to 2 orders of magnitude means 10 to 100 times too high. The frozen, lightless hellscape that appears in so many documentaries may have been built on math that was dramatically wrong from the start. So the eruption was real. The ash was real. But the apocalyptic winter, much less certain than the textbooks suggest. And now, the twist. The one that makes all of this genuinely strange. The genetic bottleneck is real. The data showing that all 8 billion humans share remarkably little genetic diversity is solid. Something happened to our species that squeezed our population down dramatically. The question the Toba theory was trying to answer was, what caused it? Here's what the newer science is saying. With advances in whole genome sequencing, researchers are converging on a bottleneck date of around 50,000 years ago, not 74,000. That's a gap of roughly 24,000 years between the Toba eruption and the period when human genetic diversity appears to have actually collapsed. And the leading explanation for that bottleneck isn't a volcano at all. It's the out-of-Africa migration. The one migration, out of several failed attempts across the previous 150,000 years, that actually succeeded. A relatively small group of humans left the African continent for good and spread across the rest of the world, carrying only a narrow slice of the genetic diversity that existed back home. The mystery of why all humans are so genetically similar? It's likely solved. The culprit just isn't Toba. It's us. It's the fact that one small founding population, out of several that tried and failed before it, finally left Africa and became everyone else on the planet. The volcano was a coincidence. A spectacular, terrifying, world-altering coincidence that happened to sit in the same general era as a completely unrelated population event. And there's one more piece of evidence that makes this even stranger. The genetic bottleneck signal doesn't just show up in human DNA. Research on Helicobacter pylori, a bacterium that has co-evolved with humans for hundreds of thousands of years, and currently lives in the stomachs of roughly half the people on Earth, shows a similar population bottleneck signal around 58,000 years ago. A bacterium that has been riding along inside us for all of recorded human history carries the same scar in its DNA that we carry in ours. The evidence for whatever happened to us isn't just in fossils or ancient tools. It's living inside people's bodies right now. So here's where we land. In the last few years, archaeological and paleo-environmental findings have thoroughly refuted the near-extinction theory. The Toba eruption was one of the most violent geological events in human history. It blanketed continents in ash, disrupted climate systems, and forced our ancestors to adapt under enormous pressure. None of that is in question. What's in question is the story we told about it. The story where one volcano nearly ended everything. Because the evidence now points somewhere else. The bottleneck is real. The near extinction may not have happened. And the actual cause of our genetic sameness is probably the journey itself. The small band of people who finally walked out of Africa for good and became the ancestors of everyone alive today. That's the real story. Not a species on the edge of oblivion, clinging to survival in the ash, but a species that walked through the ash, kept making tools, kept fishing the shrinking rivers, kept going, and then left. And in leaving, changed everything. If you found this one interesting, drop a comment below with what surprised you most from this video and what you'd like to see next. The chimpanzee comparison tends to get people, but I'm curious what landed for you. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. This channel goes to these kinds of places regularly, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. That was your daily dose of the fossil archives, and have a good day.